Pray with me. Lord, take me where you want me to go. Let me meet who you want me to meet. Tell me what you want me to say. And please, keep me out of your way. Amen. Please be seated. I knew a saint once, no doubt about it. My grandmother, Maudie Irwin, born in South Georgia, lived almost her entire life on various farms in that part of the country, lived to be 88 years old, long enough to meet Sydney when she was a tiny little baby. This woman was one of 7 siblings, big families back then, right? To run the farm. They had lots of children. This was free help on the land. My grandmother went to school until she was 14, which was very common at that time. And as she grew, she married my grandfather, and they started their own life for a short period of time in Atlanta, and my grandmother loved that time. But my grandfather felt the call back to a farm in South Georgia, and there they went. It was the middle of the Depression and a tough time. They had my father, but that was it. I remember asking her once why they never had any more children when she and my grandfather had come from such large families. And she said, it was the Depression, and we felt like we could only do right by one child. I think that said it all. And by right, they did. My father was raised well, and then he too married and had 3 sons. And my grandmother was so proud of her 3 grandsons. Oh my goodness. I remember like it was yesterday when we would arrive at the farm to see her. And her first words to me every time was, big smile, was, "Hey, how you?" That's Southern for, "How are you doing?" Big hugs, tables full of food, the joy of running around a farm free. For a city boy, that was a big deal. So I think you're getting the impression, and you should be, how much I admired my grandmother. She was also a woman of great faith. Her whole life in the Methodist Church, never missed a Sunday, never missed an opportunity to serve in her church when she possibly could. She would talk to me about her faith at times. And I remember well when I told her that I was marrying an Episcopalian, afraid of what the response would be. And she said to me, "You know, the Methodist Church came out of the Episcopal Church." That was my grandmother. She was always looking for ways of connection and to uplift people. Instead of saying the negative, to say the positive. I remember well their 50th anniversary. I rode with my father down to the farm to pick them up, to bring them to Atlanta, to celebrate a large party with their lifelong friends and family. And we were driving down the road, and my grandfather was telling a story from the front seat, and I was sitting in the back seat with Grandma. And some story he was telling was negative about somebody, a little on the gossipy side. And I don't remember the story at all, but I remember what my grandmother said. My grandfather's name was Jim as well, and she said, "Jim, what have I told you? If you have nothing nice to say nothing at all." And I looked at her, I think I was 14 or 15, and that just stayed with me and has always stayed with me. If you have nothing nice to say nothing at all. Our times seem very counter to that, right? It seems like the negative is what we want to say all the time. We want to bring up the bad to make people look bad in some way, shape, or form. And we think the 21st century is the only time that has done that. Like we think this is the only time where nicknames were given to people to try to make them look bad in some way, shape, or form. I know you have all heard about the disciple Thomas. He's the disciple with that awful nickname. doubting Thomas. Poor old doubting Thomas. Somewhere along the line, somebody thought they'd give him an ugly nickname to make him look bad. This poor man has caught grief for 2,000 years. And my guess is he's going to catch it for 2,000 more. To be honest, I feel for this guy. And I want to correct some of our misconceptions about him. And in doing so, I hope that I'll show actually what a model of true discipleship he is for all of us. Our tradition, you see, has singled him out as having some kind of inferior faith because he actually expressed doubt in the resurrection. He made his reservations known out loud, unlike many of us who might keep them to ourselves. And because of that, he has the dubious distinction of being the poster child for skepticism. Most people know what a doubting Thomas is, right? It's even in the dictionary. If you haven't heard the biblical story, his name is simply synonymous with doubt. All you have to do is pick up one of those dictionaries, and there it is. According to Webster, the definition of a doubting Thomas is a habitually doubtful person. Habitually. Goodness gracious. We don't know a whole lot about Thomas. We don't know a whole lot about all the disciples. But the only time we see his doubtful side is in this story. So I do think habitually might be overselling it just a little bit. But in any case, we are still left with a man who appears to have a crack in his wall of faith through which a little doubt is oozing out. Oh, how like so many of us Thomas is. And can you really blame him, though? What he is asked to accept is fantastic, truly unbelievable stuff. Keep in mind, he is hearing about the resurrection secondhand. The other disciples had the advantage of seeing Jesus in person a few days prior. So, for Thomas, not having had the encounter with the risen Lord, this tale being spun by his delirious friends is more than a bit unbelievable. Even for us who have the benefit of knowing the end of the story, this seems unreal. I mean, it's not every day that we hear about folks rising from the dead, right? In fact, I think I would go out on a limb to say that it's a fairly rare event. Thomas was rightfully skeptical. I want you to put yourself in Thomas's shoes for a minute. Just like Thomas, pretend that you have never heard the story of Jesus' resurrection. And one day, after having attended a funeral for a friend, someone comes up and says excitedly, "You'll never guess who I saw in the ShopRite today. I saw Betty. She's alive and well, shopping in the middle of ShopRite." Would you believe that? I don't think so. I think my first concern actually would be for my friend's emotional well-being. My second thought would be that whoever my friend saw just barely must have carried some resemblance to Betty. The idea that someone would be walking around after having died the previous week is so beyond the realm of possibility that I wouldn't even entertain it. And my guess is that not many of you would either. And yes, somehow we expect Thomas to accept this news from his friends in a matter-of-fact way, like this was no big surprise at all. Poor old Thomas has become the scapegoat for the church, which sometimes says that doubt is wrong, or that it is somehow less than faithful to need a sign or a touch or a vision or some kind of personal encounter. Or maybe we don't even need external entities to make us feel that way. We ourselves feel bad about our own doubts, don't we? And we don't want to admit them. We have the impression that we are not allowed to ask hard questions without being labeled a cynic or a skeptic or worse, a faithless creature. Since when are questions bad? Since when is it wrong to admit that you don't understand everything? I have a bunch of teachers in this room. Don't you encourage your students to ask questions, to learn, to go further with their knowledge than they are today? Of course you do. Since when is it wrong for us to ask God to clarify something? Read the account of Job or the Psalms or Jonah. All those and more are books from the Bible that are filled with people with uncertainties, complaints, and questions of God. And remember, even Jesus, while hanging on that cross, cried out to God, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Folks, faith lies in conversation. What I am saying is that faith is really what prompts the conversation. Faith is when we are willing to embrace the doubts, ask those questions, and face whatever answers come our way. Faith is believing in something that is beyond our ability to fully comprehend. I think this story is a testimony to the difficulty of faith, how hard it is to believe. Faith takes work because it puts us in uncomfortable places and begs us to ask those tough questions. I also think this story validates our need for God's touch. It says that it's okay for us to ask questions of God and to hope for a personal encounter. There's nothing cut and dry about the Christian faith. It cannot be reduced to a set of rules where everything fits, where everything makes sense, where all we have to do is connect those dots. God comes in places where we sometimes least expect it, showing us that possibility has nothing to do with our ability to explain it all. Sometimes our faith asks us to look outside the box, to color outside those lines, and to believe some things that the rest of the world thinks is ridiculous. Now, many of you know my background was in marketing and advertising, and for nearly 23 years, I was forced to think outside the box every day, change with the market, stay ahead of consumer interest. Thinking of faith that way seems very natural to me. And now I think we're entering a time when we're all being called to think outside the box when we contemplate our future here at Christ Church. Just where is God calling us to go? Our faith may ask us to do things that the rest of the world simply says is crazy. The concept of resurrection is ridiculous. But an encounter with the risen Christ changes all that. Suddenly, what seems impossible becomes the new reality. And rules which once governed our believing and our disbelieving are blurred. Growth or the status quo, and even the lines between life and death, which once seemed so absolute, have been crossed. Thomas's story, like our own, is one that encounters doubt, deals with it. But it's also a story of God's ability to change that doubt into faith. Not erase the doubt, but overcome it with an irresistible encounter with the impossible. Faith is that crazy, crazy thing that allows us to believe when everything else says impossible. Our story here is an exciting one. As we engage our own possibilities with the future. And I pray that we'll turn to Thomas for an example. May fear and doubt decrease within our own hearts. And as we encounter God, may we exclaim, like Thomas, with one of the clearest statements of faith I have ever found in Scripture: "My Lord and my God." Amen. If you would all please stand, and turning to page 3 in your bulletin, join me in the reaffirmation of our faith by reciting the Nicene Creed.